folks, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Rice cakes. It's quite common to hear from people that are trying to lose weight, or those people who are trying to improve their diet, particularly women. I find they seem to be attracted to consuming rice cakes in the belief that they are in some way improving their health, or that may aid their weight loss. So I wanted to do a quick video on rice cakes and why I think they are a very poor quality food and why they are a poor choice to put in a healthy diet. Rice is a cereal grain. There are many varieties of rice, and some rice has high polyphenol content. Some of it is coloured, and therefore it contains things like anthocyanins. And there are nutrients in rice. If rice is grown in fertile soil, it can contain minerals, and it can contain vitamins as well. And so rice, like all cereals, when taken in moderation, can be part of a healthy diet. There's nothing wrong with consuming rice. Large proportion of countries in Asia, for example, use rice as their staple. There's their staple part of their diet, and generally those populations are very healthy. Rice can be consumed with other foods. It's very versatile, and there's nothing wrong with consuming rice. The problem comes when we start, as with all carbohydrates, is when we start processing the cereal grains into other things. We commonly do this in the West with cereals to produce breakfast cereals. Most breakfast cereals that you can buy from supermarkets are very low quality foods. They have additional sugar, which makes them even worse. But it's the processing of the carbohydrate of the grain that really causes the trouble, and this is the problem with rice cakes. If we have a look at the glycemic index of rice cakes, the glycemic index is a reflection of how rapidly your blood sugar levels will rise in response to a particular food. It's not the best measure of carbohydrate quality, but it's quite a useful measure for normal people that want a general understanding of how good a quality a carbohydrate could be. If we look at the standard, which is usually white bread or glucose, it's given a value of 100. Anything below 100 produces a blood sugar rise which is less than white bread or as glucose, which are the two standards at 100. So the glycemic index of rice cakes is about 80, 82, depending on which table you look at, which is relatively high. There are high quality foods that are higher than that, and I'll explain why that high value is actually detrimental. If we look at rice, unprocessed rice in its cereal form, the glycemic index of rice actually varies depending on the variety of rice, and it can vary anywhere from about 72 down to about 50. And the reason that rice has such a variable glycemic index is because there are many different varieties of rice, and they have different ratios of amylopectin to amylose, and that's the starch in that's the forms of the starch in the rice grain. Amylose is a straight chain of glucose, so it's one glucose unit joined end to end with another glucose unit to form polysaccharides, these starch grains. And amylose, when it's consumed by humans, are enzymes, amylase. They can only clip one glucose unit off at a time, and therefore amylose is digested from the end, so we digest one glucose unit at a time. Amylopectin has a very different structure. It's very similar to animal glycogen in that it has a branch structure, and the reason that we have a branch structure in our glycogen in our liver and in our skeletal muscle is because we require the glycogen to be broken down very quickly. So the enzymes that that break down the glucose units off the glycogen, and the enzymes that would also break down hydrolyze the glucose units off the amylopectin when we consume it, they can knock off multiple glucose units at a time because it has a branch structure, and therefore it has more than two ends. Amylose, if you think about it being a straight chain, only has two ends, so you can only clip one glucose unit off each end at a time. So that gives you two glucose units. per unit time. Amylopectin, being branched, has multiple ends to the molecule, and therefore the enzymes can attack multiple points, and therefore the glucose, for example, can be the amount of glucose units that you produce is equal to the amount of branch points that you have. So the take-home message from that is amylopectin is a very quickly digest starch molecule, and amylose is a much slower digesting starch molecule. So those rice varieties that have more amylopectin tend to be higher on the glycemic index than those that are that have more amylose. So the amylose to amylopectin ratio in carbohydrates is another measure of the quality. Now, the highest glycemic index rice is in the 70s, but rice cakes are in the 80s. So they're considerably higher than the most quickly digesting rice. Rice cakes are more quickly digested, and this is really the problem with rice cakes. They because they've been processed in a very similar way to many breakfast cereals. The grain's broken open. Often lots of the fibre is removed. Often there is the addition of things like salt to make them taste better. But it's this breaking open of the cereal grain to release the starchy content, which is the bit that we describe as carbohydrate, and the removal of some of the fibre increases the rate that the digestive enzymes in the gut are able to break off these glucose units. And that means that because the glucose units are more quickly digested, they're more quickly hydrolyzed, they're more quickly absorbed to the blood. And it's that increase in the amount of glucose in the blood that can cause problems, because it leads to the nutrient overload syndrome, and the body is not very good at coping with large amounts of nutrients at one time. Rapid rises in blood glucose levels tend to shunt metabolic pathways into a kind of a protective mode, and that glucose can be quite damaging. So much of that glucose, if it gets into the blood too quickly, obviously it causes an increase in the release of insulin. Some of that glucose will end up undoubtedly as fatty acids, and those fatty acids, if they start to accumulate in tissues, can lead to insulin resistance. So generally, carbohydrates that are digested more quickly tend to have detrimental glycemic effects, and those detrimental glycemic effects can lead to insulin resistance and weight gain, and the development of syndromes such as the metabolic syndrome. So what we really want to do in a high quality diet is consume carbohydrates that have lower glycemic indices. So the best varieties of rice to go for would be those that tend to have more amylose and less amylopectin. They tend to be the longer grain rices, and they would be a better choice in a diet. Of course, we can mix the foods with other foods, and that will lower the glycemic index. If we, for example, consume protein with our rice, so if we have rice with fish, the fish will slow the digestion of the starch, because the fish contains protein. Protein is digested mainly in the stomach. That's why we have an acidic stomach. It's to hydrolyze the protein bonds to produce amino acids and smaller peptide chains. And the body doesn't like the protein entering the small intestine before it's been tenderized in the stomach, and therefore protein tends to have this holding ability of food in the stomach. If you consume high amounts of protein with other foods, these foods tend to stay in the stomach for longer, which means that they will reach the small intestine at a later time point, and that means that the glucose will then be absorbed more slowly into the blood. So protein has a very beneficial effect on the glycemic effect of carbohydrates. It can slow the digestion of carbohydrates, and that is maybe why high protein diets tend to have weight loss effects. The thing about rice cakes is when you often see people consuming them, they consume them as snacks, and they generally consume them on their own. They won't put things like butter and cheese on them because they think that the butter and the cheese have too much energy in them. So they look at the nutrients, the ingredients, they see, oh, there's no fat, so as long as I only eat rice cakes, I'm not going to get fat. That's unfortunate, because by excluding other foods and eating them like that and eating them on their own, you're actually increasing the rate that the glucose units can get into the blood, and this causes obviously that detrimental glycemic effect. Too much insulin, too much blood sugar, and then you get all of the detrimental effects as well, because not only is that bad for your health, it's also bad for your thinking and your thought processes, because after your blood sugar has risen quickly, it tends to fall quickly, and as it falls, you tend to lose the ability to think rationally. Your brain is starved of glucose. You will also release hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol because your blood glucose levels have dropped. Body sees that as an alarm situation, so it will try to mobilize glucose stores from the liver, and to do this it needs to release the catecholamine hormones such as adrenaline and noradrenaline, and it will also release hormones such as cortisol as well. So that's detrimental because those are stress hormones. So consuming these high glycemic index carbohydrates such as rice cakes actually has a detrimental effect on your hormonal levels as well, because it stimulates stress hormones, and it's actually a form of stress for the body. So you're actually giving yourself extra stress. So that's really why rice cakes are detrimental, and obviously many of them have the fiber stripped away from them, and fiber is another modulating factor that can slow the rate of glucose into the blood, particularly when the fiber is in its original form. If you cook rice in a pan, you put the whole cereal grain into the pan, you cook it in water. Now, cereal grains all have a very similar structure. They tend to have a starchy endosperm in the middle, which is where the starch is, the carbohydrate part. They have a germ layer, which is where most of the nutrients are, and surrounding that they tend to have this bran layer, and the bran is the fiber. If you cook rice in a pan, the fiber remains around the starch, and therefore it's a protective coat that stops our digestive enzymes getting to the starch. It slows the digestion, and it's the ability to keep the cereal grain in its original whole form with the fiber around the outside that makes other cereal grains such as rolled oats, gives them a low glycemic index. Their fiber is still there. There's a physical barrier for our enzymes to attack the starch and get the glucose broken off, and that slows the digestion rate. Fiber it also acts as a physical barrier in the intestine to stop the absorption of the glucose, particularly if it's soluble fiber. It actually forms a gel along the brush border of the enterocytes, and that's a physical border for the absorption of glucose. So fiber has these beneficial glycemic effects as well, and many rice cakes are really a lot of the fiber has been stripped away. The germ layer will also have been stripped away, which will have removed much of the many of the essential nutrients like the vitamins and minerals. And of course, those accessory nutrients, the vitamins and minerals, are required for the absorption. They're required for the metabolism of the carbohydrates, and then many of the B vitamins that you find in cereal grains are the same B vitamins that are required for the metabolic pathways that then deal subsequently with the glucose that is produced. So nature is very good at packaging these things together so that when we consume the whole cereal grain, we get all the things we need to not only slowly digest the carbohydrates, but also to provide us with the accessory nutrients that allow our metabolism to correctly metabolize these nutrients. If we strip the germ layer and the bran layer away, we process the cereal grain, what we end up with is something that's not too similar from sugar, really. It's just a very refined form of, it's not a disaccharide, okay, the starch is still in a polysaccharide form, but it's still very quickly digested, and that's the problem with rice cakes. There are other products like rice cakes. There are many brand names that use cereals to create dry biscuits that they're aimed really at women, particularly women that want to lose weight. They always market themselves as having very little fat, and that's true, but that's not going to stop you producing fat from the glucose that's subsequently broken off. Your body is quite capable of taking glucose and converting it to acetate units and then joining them together to create fatty acids and creating triglycerides. You have the metabolic enzyme, you have the enzymes, you have the metabolic pathways to produce fat from glucose. So because a food doesn't have fat in it, doesn't mean that you're not going to produce fat from that food. So that that's another misconception in nutrition. People look at the nutritional label and think, well, there's no fat in it. that doesn't mean that you're not going to produce fat molecules from the food. Your body is much cleverer than that. So really, my overall recommendation is, is really to avoid foods like this. Biscuits, cakes, rice cakes, anything with added sugar, anything that's been processed is really a low quality food. You should be eating high quality foods, and that means eating foods in their original whole form. You should eat foods that go off, and you should eat them before they go off. If anything that you can put in your cupboard and it lasts, for years before it expires in terms of its sell-by date, is probably not a healthy food. There are exceptions. You can store some healthy foods for long periods of time, but generally, if it comes in a packet, a glossy packet, and you can leave it in your cupboard for 2 years before you have to eat it, it's probably not a healthy food. And I think rice cakes fall into that category very nicely. Many people, they eat rice cakes believing they're doing their health some good. Many people eat rice cakes believing that it's going to help with their weight loss, and it's actually having the opposite effect. They're detrimental to your health, and they will cause you to gain weight if you consume them regularly. So my recommendation would be to avoid them as a food where possible, and consume rice in its whole form. There's nothing wrong with that. Or find a carbohydrate that is in its whole form that you can consume, that contains fiber, that contains essential nutrients that go with any of the starch that you're going to get. So therefore you have this balance of energy along with other accessory nutrients. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that's helped some people, and perhaps persuaded some people that rice cakes are perhaps not the healthiest food on the planet. Remember to eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself. And I will see you soon for another video. Take care.